Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
There was a time when NFL rosters were significantly smaller than they are today. A time when football players were expected to play on both sides of the line of scrimmage, offense and defense. Some were expected to line up on special teams as well, again, on both sides of the line of scrimmage. Today, they are referred to as 60-minute men, and there aren't any in the game we watch now. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll take a look back on this forgotten era of the game and talk about a few of these special players, the NFL's 60-minute men.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 138, the NFL's 60-minute men, with an old friend of the podcast, Chris Willis, who recently released a book published by McFarland Publishing called The NFL's 60-Minute Men, All-Time Greats of the Two-Way Player Era, 1920 to 1945. You know, not too long ago, Deion Sanders played a little wide receiver to go along with his exploits as an all-pro defensive back. Outside of Deion, you have to go pretty far back to find a cadre of players who played every down on each side of the line of scrimmage every game. Today, we are going to talk about a few of them, what the definition of a 60-minute player really is, and just how special some of them were. Now, for many of you, I think you might be surprised to learn that a guy like Don Hutson was not only a great receiver, but he was also one of the best defensive backs in the game. In fact, one year, he co-led the NFL in interceptions. Or that Sammy Baugh was not only slinging the ball downfield, but he too was one of the game's best punters, and he was also a terrific defensive back who also led the NFL in interceptions. In fact, not only did Sammy lead the NFL several times in passing yards and twice in touchdowns, he also had 31 career interceptions, and 5 times he led the NFL in punting. And we'll also talk about another two-sport star as we move from the baseball season to the football season, Cal Hubbard. Another 60-minute man, Hubbard was also a Major League Baseball umpire and was not only inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, he was also enshrined into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. So we have a lot to cover on today's show. Before we get there, though, please follow, rate, and review Sports Forgotten Heroes wherever you listen. And don't forget, you can watch this full interview on the Sports Forgotten Heroes channel on YouTube. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Chris Willis. Chris, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could jump aboard.
Oh, thanks for having me, Warren. I'm excited to talk a little 60-minute men.
Yeah. What a terrific concept for a book. And it's a really interesting book. And let's just dive straight into it. For me, Chris, would you please define your definition of an NFL 60-minute man?
That's a good question. So I think my definition would be, especially at the pro football level, at the NFL. It was just an athlete who didn't want to leave the field. You would play offense, defense, special teams. You just didn't want to leave. It's almost like when you go play pickup basketball, 5-on-5, you just didn't want to leave the court. You didn't want to sit and wait for next. So I think a 60-minute men, was just an athlete who didn't want to leave. I remember some of the research, like Ernie Nevers quoted as, "Hey, I don't think I would like the modern game because I would hate sitting for half the time." Yeah, you're an offensive player, but he said I just would have hated sitting half the time. So to me, it's just a guy who just would do whatever it takes to stay on the field, for as long as he could.
Sure. Now, you have a unique perspective on all of this, are able to do more research and have more things available to you than, say, a person like me because of your role and what you do for a living. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm the head archivist at NFL Films. It's a role I've done. This is my 29th year at NFL Films. So to be able to lean into that part of research, I love doing it, and also it is a little frustrating at times because there's not as much footage of 20s and 30s and 40s as we see of the last 40, 50 years when film started. So so that part can be but like I said, it does give me an advantage to, hey, look, what do we have some of these guys, especially when you're looking back at doing research of the 20s and 30s.
Sure. Of course, the game has changed dramatically since those early days, as you would expect. And I think one way to understand what a 60-minute player is to talk about roster construction and how it has evolved over the years. And I'd like to go there. Talk about an NFL roster and how it has transformed since the 1920s and the 40s, the 60s. You don't have to go through every decade, but talk about how a roster has transformed. There was a time when you didn't have as many players on the sidelines, and they had to play multiple positions, as opposed to today, where I don't know if the right term is a specialist, but a running back is a running back, quarterback is a quarterback, a linebacker is a linebacker, well, for the most part. But talk about how the roster has evolved and how back in the day you did play both sides of the ball.
Yeah, that's just the way the game was played. In 1920, like even high school, college, and the NFL, you had roughly 16-man rosters. So for the most part, you played 60 minutes, and you had a handful of backups. Even in the 30s and into the 40s, when it got to like 18 and 24, like you're still limited to what you can do, and a lot of guys played multiple positions, or even you would have, there was a lot of offensive tackles and linemen who kicked, and punted because, somebody had to do it. So, it wasn't just, you had a punter and a kicker. Like nowadays with 53-man rosters, everybody has their specialist, like you mentioned. So I think you tried everything, even if you're somebody like Fats Henry and, you're a kicker and a punter, but you're also a 250-pound tackle, for the majority of the game, playing offense and defense, you still did it because, what if the best kicker got hurt or your best punter got hurt, and then you got to put somebody in there to do that functionally. So yes, the rosters were a huge thing of developing, this sort of the game through what we call, single platoon to, unlimited. So substitution. So the rosters was a huge factor in how players developed, through the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
So my last podcast that I did, Ace Parker, in my mind, he is probably one of the quintessential 60-minute men. He played quarterback and tailback. He was a defensive back. He kicked the ball. He punted the ball. He returned kickoffs. He returned punts. I mean, there is virtually not a single thing on the field, not for 1 second, that he didn't have a position to play. He was what I would call the quintessential, the true 60-minute man. In your mind, who is the most famous or the greatest 60-minute player, and why? Why do you think that particular player is the greatest?
Wow, that's a tough one. But that's what I wrote the book for too. After sort of just digging in and doing a lot of the research, which was fun to do, of that era, I just love, the era that started the NFL, and I mean, he's on the cover. I just think Dutch Clark, was a tremendous player when. Years ago when I started doing a little research and I did a biography on Dutch, I didn't realize how great he was. Some players from the 20s, 30s do get built up a little bit with some of the newspaper writing and the sports writers. So you have to, really dig deep and look at the game. And Dutch, to me, got even better as more research that I did. And I just think he was the perfect player, from that era. He dominated games, I think, like no other player, not just offensively, defensively, and special teams wise, leadership, there was quotes from his teammates and opponents is just like, you know what, if I had the first pick of a team, Dutch would be my pick. Cal Hubbard said that. Bronco Nagurski said that. And then he just sort of, to me, like I said, is the perfect sort of player of that era. And then in the 1930s, the Associated Press had a football player of the decade. In the 20s, it was Red Grange, which was an obvious choice. But in the 30s, it wasn't quite as obvious, and the Associated Press picked Dutch Clark. This is the same decade that had Don Hudson, Sammy Ball, Johnny Blood, Mel Hine, like a really great group of players in the 30s. And they picked Dutch, and so to me, you could almost say, that Dutch is to me the perfect player from the 60-minute era.
And of course, if anybody wants to learn more about Dutch, Chris and I did an episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes a couple years back, episode number 89, back in 2020. You and I talked about Dutch here on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Who is the last 60-minute player?
To me, my research, I sort of cut it off from 1920 to 1945. My reason was I wanted pretty much the players that played 60 minutes against other players against 60 minutes. You could say that Chuck Bednarik was the last of the 60-minute men. And he probably, like he is, he played 60 minutes in 1960, but he wasn't playing against players who did. So, it's a tremendous feat. It might be a little bit better than some of the feats from the guys, but I wanted it to just say, let's keep it in that era where it was before unlimited substitutions and, some players, because there were some players like George Connor, Charlie Trippi. I mean, Bob Waterfield was a rookie in 45, and obviously Chuck Bednarik. So some of these players did go both ways, but they weren't playing against, full rosters that were going 60 minutes. So I just kept it within the sort of 60-minute era. But the choice would be Chuck Bednarik would probably say be the last. I know Dion played a little offense defense in his days. I'm not sure if he did all 60 minutes at one time, but, but those are the players.
So, Chris, we are right now at this time of year, what I like to call the transition period, where Major League Baseball and the NFL are both very much at the fore of the conversation for sports fans. Major League Baseball is hitting the home stretch. We're in the final third of the season, almost the final quarter of the season. And NFL training camps, as we are recording this, are starting to, we'll say, wind down, and the season is right around the corner. And so I'd like to start there with someone who participated in baseball and participated in the NFL, and that would be Cal Hubbard. The reason I say participated is because he was a big figure in both, but he didn't play baseball. He was a baseball umpire. So, um, what challenges, if you can, what challenges do you think Hubbard faced in transitioning from playing professional football, the NFL, to to being an umpire in Major League Baseball, and how did he overcome that?
Well, I mean, I think the challenges for him is, first being up on the rules. The football and baseball are different rules. So if you're going to be an umpire, and I think he took it serious, while he was playing, he actually did some umpiring in the summer, even when he was finishing his NFL career. So he enjoyed it. So, and he was good at it. So I think the challenge for him was just, what, I want to be good at this, because I'm not going to play football forever. And he loved sports, he was a big sports fan. So I think for him was, let me be the best at this. Let me learn everything. And obviously, his umpiring career not only took him to be an everyday umpire, but then he was supervisor of umpires too. So he knew his stuff, and people respected him. I mean, being 6'4", 6'5", and 270 or whatever helps to be an imposing figure. But he worked hard at it to know what he was doing.
Yeah, and just so everybody out there knows, it was a lot different back then, again, than it is today. To become a professional baseball umpire, there's a lot of schooling, a lot of working your way through the minor leagues, and a lot different, the road to becoming an umpire today versus back when Cal did it. Cal's physical presence and his athleticism made him both a force on offense and defense. Talk about that.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, he just was just a physically big dude. I mean, with the way you can train now, he would easily be able to play in the NFL now. 6'4", 6'5", just 260, 270, 275 at sometimes. He was just a physically big guy. From the Midwest. So, and he had a little bit of an attitude. There was a lot of quotes and stories about, going at it with players. Nothing illegal, but, just, hey, it was going to be a long day if you went against Cal. But this to show how great of an athlete was. He spent his first couple years with the Giants as an end. He was an all-pro end, to start his career. Then he went and played in Green Bay, and he's like, oh, I love this city. This city's great. So he ends up asking to be signed by the Packers, and he goes to sign with the Packers. And then he becomes a tackle on offense and defense, and, just is a big piece of that early Packer dynasty that won 3 straight championships, between 29, 30, and 31. So he was somebody like, now you would have to game plan. Oh, we got to stop him, especially on defense. And just because, like I said, he was just physically imposing, and he could move for a big guy. Like I said, he was an end, which is different techniques in the two-way end than it is a tackle. End, you got to be able to move and stuff, and you got to be able to catch the ball. You're doing some reverses at times. Whereas tackle, you're pretty much going straight ahead. You're blocking your man straight ahead, or you're charging on defense. So those skill levels were different to play both. And for him to play at that high of a level, he's just, like I said, just was a tremendous player. And like I said, he's in my top 10. Don't want to give away the entire list, but he's in the top 10. That's how great he was.
How how analytical a player was he? And what I mean by that is he went on to become a baseball umpire. So he had to study baseball. He had to learn the game, understand the rules, and be able to talk about the rules and officiate that way. How important was that to his football career to be able to analyze a game and then play the game that way?
Well, I think it's what gets lost a little bit now. Like we can look back like, oh, Peyton Manning was a student of the game, Tom Brady, student of the game. Ed Reed was a student of the game, Ray Lewis. And that's all true, but that's not a new thing. And even the players in the 20s and 30s, you just think, oh, they just ran the ball and it punted, didn't do anything. And that's not true. When you watch some of the footage and then you read up on the games and especially when you read the interviews and oral history, like there was times where you read and there's more to it. And I think that's why these players are great, whether it's Cal Hubbard from a lineman standpoint, Don Hudson, sort of learning how to run routes or make moves. I remember quotes from Red Grange. These are from like 1925, 1926. He's talking about how your legs are the most important thing in football. Like you have to keep them, and that's the reason why he delivered ice, because he knew that would give him 2 months, 3 months start, because he would deliver ice to it, and it helped his legs. And so to think that, maybe there were some, and there are obviously some players that might just, we just lined up and we slugged and I got my money, $50 a game. But I think some of the great ones looked at beyond that, and it's like today, there's a difference between an Ed Reed and just a guy who, might have been a starter for, 3 or 4 years, and Cal was one of those. So I'm impressed when I go and find, especially the oral histories and the interviews, some old interviews or newspaper interviews, and you get to hear them talk about how they played the game. And like I said, I think they were much smarter, and there were a lot of students of the game in the 20s, 30s, even today.
Well, how did he contribute? Because again, it was the late 20s, early 30s. So how did Cal Hubbard contribute to the evolution of football strategy during his time as a player, particularly in the roles of tackle and end?
Yeah, some players like Hubbard, I think Link Lyman was another one where their style of play all of a sudden became, a little bit of, let me copy what he does because he's successful. The NFL's always been labeled a copycat league. So some of these players, even like Hudson, some players just couldn't do it. But Don Hudson could run routes and he could, use his hands, use his body. And then that sort of starts rubbing off. And then every player's like that, every player's trying to train like that. And then obviously, the players from the 50s and the 60s were much better athletes, So I think for Cal, obviously his size helped, he was just a strong, big dude. And, but sometimes his technique, like I said, sometimes you had to be tough and rough. And then sometimes you had to figure out, or this guy's giving me trouble, not every, he didn't dominate everybody. Link Lyman's on the opposite side, or Turk Edwards, and then you got to block them, and he's got to learn how to do that, So yeah, I like we talked about student of the game and techniques. Some of these players knew what they were doing, and that's why they were great, and they stood out.
Well, another player you talked about in your book and who you've already referred to a couple of times here on Sports Forgotten Heroes is Chuck Bednarik, another great, famous 60-minute man. He played center and linebacker, so not the glamour positions of quarterback and tailback and, defensive back. What was, in your mind, the most memorable moment of Bednarik's career, and how did that moment, if you can, define his legacy as the last of the 60-minute men?
Well, Chuck had a really great career. I mean, he's a member of a couple Eagle championship teams. For his 60-minute, it probably was the 1960 NFL championship game against Lombardi's Packers. It was a low-scoring game, Franklin Field in Philadelphia, and that was Lombardi's only loss in a postseason game. And Ben Eric the Packers were driving, with under 20 seconds left, and he makes a tackle on Jim Taylor, and he sees that the clock's going to expire, and says this effing game's over. And he loved to tell that story in interviews and stuff, but that was it. Like, hey, he was there the entire game, and he made the last tackle, to sort of preserve the victory. So Concrete Charlie, lives on, sort of with that legacy.
Yeah, Concrete Charlie. How did his tough, hard-hitting style of play on his opponents, how did that help the evolution of the NFL's physicality?
Well, I mean, the game's always been pretty tough and rough, so to speak. The 20s and 30s were known to be a little loose and with the rules, but those got sort of better organized, throughout those decades. But by the time Ben Eric was playing, 48, 49 in his first couple of years into the 50s, then on TV it became a little bit more sort of, I wouldn't say advertised, but the ability for fans to watch not only at games, but now they could see some on TV, that some things were, or some play was violent, at times. And Chuck was part of that. He was a really physical player, especially from his linebacker position, playing outside linebacker the majority of the time. And he just loved contact, and, that era, had some hits like that and savagery, and, him knocking out Gifford in 1960. Like, so there's a lot of that physicality that he grew up in that was, like if you grew up in the 70s, you saw some clothesline tackles and that type of stuff. That's just the way the game was played. Those weren't outlawed yet, and you saw them. So he was part of that.
There were so many 60-minute men, but not all of them were studs on both sides of the field. Some of them played out of necessity. Chuck Bednarik was a stud at center. Chuck Bednarik was a stud at linebacker. How did his ability to star at both of those positions contribute to the Eagles' success during his career?
Well, I mean, you always got to start. I mean, like in baseball, you start up the middle. Your center, your quarterback, and your halfback or your tailback at the time. So he was a big part of that. I mean, he's a big focus of the run game. With Steve Van Buren early in his career, and then the passing with Norv Van Brocklin later in his career. So he was able to adapt and play at a high level. Like I said, he didn't leave the game hardly, and he didn't have a lot of injuries. So like I said, the Concrete Charlie, the nickname fit him well.
How would his game from back then translate to the game of today?
Well, I mean, I think he could play either position. He wasn't the fastest guy, so maybe middle linebacker instead of outside linebacker. But he could play inside if you want. But he'd probably be, a Pro Bowl, All-Pro center easily in today's game. He would, because you got to translate to what they would do today. You just can't take size and speed. Well, he would train like any center would do today, and he would easily, I think, be an upper echelon center.
The next player I want to discuss, I think some people would actually find it a little surprising that he is a 60-minute man, and that's Don Hutson. We see the highlights. We hear about how great a receiver he is, but he was also a pretty darn good safety. How did his dual role as a receiver and a safety influenced the Packers' strategy and success during his career?
Yeah, Hudson's a unique, like you mentioned, he gets so much praise for his sort of offensive work, which is well deserved. The highlights are just unreal compared to other people. Everybody says, you can call that guy's a dog or that guy's a dude. Well, he was a dude back then. You could tell he was better than 99% of the other players just by the way he walked and the way he ran, the way he caught the ball. But he had some hard knocks on defense, because traditionally ends offensive play, the end position on defense, but his size was a little, not quite where it needed to be, maybe in the 180 and maybe, 190, 195 would have been a little better, like Bill Hewitt or Red Bagro, those type of players, a little bit bigger, maybe a little thicker is the word. So he struggled at end, but then they were like, you know what? Let's move him to, like say what you would call like the defensive halfback, because they got a player named Larry Craig who played fullback. So what they did was, this is Lambeau, being a little ahead of his time. He would put Craig at end, and he would move Hudson away and would be more in space, where he could cover a little bit more, track the ball. And you see it later in his career. Hudson has a very good interceptions, count and everything you look at. So he's obviously around the ball. He's making plays. Maybe the tackle total isn't as good as you would see. But he's obviously making more of an impact from that defensive halfback position with takeaways and pass breaks ups and things like that. So he made himself, I think, a better defensive player. Obviously, the change of position helped, but I think Hudson, and he also kicked and he kicked. He didn't do much punting, but he kicked too. And like I said, was a better, probably all around player than maybe perceived as. He was the greatest receiver until Jerry Rice came along.
Well, I think some people would find it surprising, as you alluded to, that he did lead the NFL in interceptions. Ironically, it was 1940. He co-led with Ace Parker. They each had 6. But one year, 1943, he had as many as 8 interceptions in a season. He had 30 for his career. I mean, he could play both sides of the ball for sure. But as a receiver, he was spectacular. There was just something special about Don Hudson as a receiver. Was there anything special that he did, his style, the way he played the game, that helped that position evolve into what it is today?
Yeah, I think almost everything he did was to be the best and to, give him an edge. There's some reports and things like, he didn't really wear shoulder pads and he didn't wear, great knee pads or type just because he wanted to be as fast as he could. He wore the eye black. There's photos of him wearing eye black, to take the glare out of, the sun when, it was sunny days. So, and he mentioned a lot of times there were several interviews where he mentioned, he would practice different catches and different routes all the time. Like he said, he's almost like Jerry Rice, for every one ball he caught, he caught, 100 or 1,000 in practice, so whether it was a deep out or a go or a hitch or, a quick slant or something, he practiced that, I don't know if every end in the league was practicing, different techniques and routes and way to catch, each individual pass. But he was, and you could tell that there's a difference at end. I think probably in any other position in the 2A era, he looked so much better than the other ends. Like I said, I think Guy Chamberlain I really like, but his 20s end was a little bit different. But Bill Hewitt's a great end, but he didn't do the things that that Don Hudson did. Ray Flaherty was very good in. Red Back didn't. And they grew up almost, in the same era or a little bit before. And you could tell there was a big difference of what he was doing just stylistic, like I said, technique wise than the other guys. And so very influential, I think.
Yeah, and like we said, I mean, I think most people would recognize Don Hudson as one of the greatest receivers of all time. Heck, he led the league in receptions and yards and touchdowns on so many different occasions. But again, going back to defense, he also was a major contributor to the Packers' dominance on defense. Just how big a contribution did Don Hudson make on a yearly basis to that defense, and how integral a part was he on the Packers defense to make them the special team that they were?
Yeah, I mean, I think what with any team that wins multiple championships, which the Packers did when Hudson was there, you have great levels of offense, great levels of defense. So the D line in Green Bay was very good. Like we mentioned Larry Craig and his ability, Larry Brock. Then at the linebacker, you had Clark Hinkle, who people think was just as good as Bronco Nagurski at fullback. And then in the defensive backfield, you had guys like Cecil Isbell or Ernie Herbert, who were the quarterbacks who played, and Don Hunt. So I think he just fed on that. You could almost make like a modern correlation to any of these really good early teams and say, oh, look at the 2002 Buccaneers. You had Warren Sapp and Simeon Rice up front. You had Derek Brooks, at linebacker. And you had John Lynch in the middle. You had Rondé. Like, that was the Packers of the 30s. You had these type of players, and that's why they won a few championships. And he was a part of that. Maybe he gets overlooked on his defensive side, but he obviously contributed. Anytime you could take away the ball, 30 times at least as an interception, that's 30 extra possessions, so that's definitely going to help your squad.
To me, Chris, one of the most fascinating players on this list in your book, and I mean, you talk about dozens of guys, and before we do leave, I'm going to ask you to give us your top 10. But to me, one of the most fascinating names on the list is Sammy Baugh. Just, again, like Don Hudson, we know so much about Sammy's exploits as a quarterback, but he too led the NFL in interceptions one year. It was 1941. He had 11 interceptions. He had 31 for his career. Talk to us about just how complete a football player Sammy Baugh was.
Yeah, see, you're talking about the greats of the 60-minute, with Hudson and Paul was just tremendous. He's another one when you watch some of the footage and you're just like, he's just different, whether, like you said, whether he's quarterbacking, whether he's punting. He was one of the best, probably, him and Vernon Welling were probably two best punters of that first 25 years. And he was really good as a defensive back, and I mean, one of his greatest games was around that time, in 43, I believe. He had 4 touchdown passes and 4 interceptions on defense in the same game against the Lions. And that's, I mean, today you would never maybe see it in a high school game with a kid, but just imagine doing that. And he did that routinely, just great play after play. He was about as competitive as you could be. He did not want, I mean, he's from Texas. He did not want to get beat. He's like, these suckers ain't beating us today. Like, he would take it personal. But then at the end of the day, he would shake your hand and just say, great game. But he did it all, and, like I said, even though there's 45 guys in with profiles in the book, like, those elite guys, there's even a difference between them and maybe even the guys in the 20s and 30s, number 20, number 30, number 4, like, Ball and Hudson, like I said, were two of the elite. And And Sammy, is right up there with his talent, and he could play today. He always said, he would love to play quarterback. He's like, it's a passing man's game today, and he would just he could play in the era.
If you could, I don't know if you can, but if you could, to help us try and paint a picture of the type of quarterback that Sammy Ball was, who in today's game could you say has the most similar game to the way that Sammy played?
Wow, that's a tough one. Because he has some size, he was a tall, thin guy, but his throwing motion was so unique, because it had this looping, he could just drop it into the basket from 50 yards, more than, so his arm style reminds me of somebody like Matthew Stafford, which, where you throw from any different angle. Obviously, Matthew Stafford, I think, threw the ball harder. I just think they tend to throw the ball harder nowadays because it's an easier ball to throw than they did in the 20s and 30s. But he's got this looping style that just he just had such great touch and great accuracy. It's tough to find somebody who throws the ball like that in a more modern game. Because of the way he threw, just with this looping style. If you look at it's just like, okay, I'm laid in there, and then it's sort of smaller throws, a little bit of a dart, and somebody like that. So, because it's hard to find somebody who throws kind of loopy, if that's the word.
The guys like ball quarterbacks, really good quarterbacks, were really good defenders as well. Sammy played both sides of the ball and played them so effectively. Who else on your list that you included in your book was a quarterback that played defense so darned well that he could have just been a stud defensive player and never have to play quarterback?
Not as well as Sammy, I think
he was special.
Yeah, I think Patty Driscoll is up there. He could play offense and defense. Now Sid Luckman, I don't think was quite as good on defense. Definitely not as good as Sammy. I think it was, and you see in Luckman's career as he got older, he didn't play quite as much defense. Once you got past 45, so. Other guys, I think, might not be quite. Benny Friedman, I think, was a pretty good defender. And to me, later, or Ed Donowski of the Giants, on that sneaker team, could play some defense. So those guys kind of stand out a little bit better. But like I said, Sammy's almost heads and shoulders even ahead of the great ones, or the Hall of Famers. You'd be like, oh yeah, he's still head and shoulders above them.
Special talents are special talents, and Sammy was a special talent. Any part of his game from back then translate to the game that's played today?
No, I definitely think he could play quarterback. He might even could play safety, like a free safety. But I also think he would be a full-time punter, so like he could choose his thing. Like, hey, do I want to throw, or do I want to hit, from like a free safety standpoint, cause he could run. He played minor league baseball. Like, he was a very good athlete. But he was about as good a punter too. So he could easily be, an all pro, probably at all three, at that level.
Okay, the last two on my list, we'll start with this one. These are two of, I think, the biggest, most familiar names in football history. And we're going to start with Bronco Nagurski. Just the name says football,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
How did Bronco's unique combination of power and athleticism make him one of the most feared players of his era, perhaps one of the most feared players of all time.
Yeah, Bronco's just a great, just a great character, and was just a great player. I mean, he just combined all his natural gifts. I mean, he's 6'2", almost 6'3". He's 235, I think, at his prime, and could probably outrun in any back, maybe a handful back, So he had the perfect combination, size and speed. I mean, the NFL Combine would love him nowadays because he would just like, oh my God, here's a guy 6'3" and 230 and runs this fast and does the agility this well. So I mean, he turned out to be a world champion wrestler too. So it just shows you how he could move, how he could use his hands, how he could use his contact. I mean, he had this running style where, like I said, you're either going to hit him in his legs, which are probably going to hurt you, or he would lower his shoulder and just run right through you. So he was definitely special. And like I said, the name just sort of made him play Hey, I'm going to go play football. So yeah.
What I find interesting is that how some teams are. I was just thinking of this. Some teams are really defined by certain players or positions. When you think of the Chicago Bears, you always think about the toughness, and you think about them over the period of time where they had Nagurski, and they had Dick Butkus, and they had Mike Singletary, and then they had Brian Urlacher. They always have these tough defenders. It's the monsters of the Midway. It fits the Chicago Bears. What was Nagurski's most significant contribution to the Bears dynasty of the 30s, and how did his two-way play impact their success?
No, he was a key cog. There's no doubt, but it wasn't really running the ball. You look at his sort of rushing ability and his overall stats. I mean, obviously, official stats weren't kept until 32, but it really wasn't running the ball that made him special. What it was, one was his intimidation. Like when you played the Bears during that year, you had to bring your A game and you had to be physically ready. Like you mentioned, monsters of midways, they were. And two, offensively, he was the lead blocker on the majority of the carry. I mean, one of the famous years is when the Bears went 13-0 in 1934. Beatty Feathers ran for 1,004 yards, like the first 1,000-yard rusher. Well, Nagurski was leading blocker on a lot of those carries. That's why he was able to gain 1,000 yards, because Broncos, sort of leading the way. They end up losing the sneaker game, to the Giants. They got upset that year. And then on defense, he's playing linebacker. You have to account for him. He's just a physical guy. And he would love to just come up, especially in the run game. He would come up and make the tackle, So I think the combination of those, he brought a physicality, with his just his physical appearance and his play. And like I said, I think his underrated thing is his lead blocking, because now, maybe he's more Moose Johnston in today's game. Obviously he probably would play linebacker because fullbacks are non-existent. There's a quote, I believe it was Red Grange would always say, because he always mentioned that Bronco was the best player he played with and against, bar none. And he said that this is like in the 1970s when he says a quote. So he's like, oh, Bronco's a combination of Dick Butkus at linebacker and Larry Zonka at fullback. And I can see both. I can see, like Bronco probably would have been better in the 70s and 80s because he would have been able to play fullback and carry the ball, a lot more. Nowadays, I think he would be a linebacker. They would just say, I'm going to be, outside or inside, maybe he's Brian Urlacher, because he's got the similar size.
so many stories about Bronco. Is there one or two that stand out to you that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think Bronco. The thing about Bronco rarely talked. You think somebody's that big, but he rarely talked. He let us play. Sort of do the talking. I think the most tremendous thing that Bronco did was in 1937, where in the summer of 1937 he wins the World Heavyweight Championship Wrestling title. And there's a responsibility being the world champion. So, which when I did the research, I'm like, okay, what is the response? And that means you're wrestling like 3 times a week, So near the end of the summer, as football's starting to come up, he's like, I can make more money being the wrestling champion of the world and going to all these cities. I mean, it would be West Coast, South, East, anywhere. And House was like, no, we got a championship team. We need you here. So they came to agreement where, like, if you see his 1937 schedule, he would wrestle in Los Angeles and Salt Lake City on Tuesday and Thursday. He would fly to the city that the Bears were playing in, or Chicago on Saturday, play on Sunday, and then might have a match on Monday or Tuesday, like in Philadelphia or Washington or, Omaha. Like, it was a ridiculous schedule they was doing. And the Bears went to the championship game in 37. They ended up losing to Sammy and Washington. But that schedule is just a juggernaut. Like, I was so impressed with what he did.
Just think about how in shape you have to be, how mentally tough you have to be, how physically fit you have to be to do all that. I mean, that speaks volumes to the type of player that Bronco Nagurski was, the type of athlete that he was. I mean, it's not just about being good at that point. You got to be strong.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's 235 pounds. Big guys usually tend to wear down, but like, even if you're, wrestling for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, sometimes those matches will go 30 minutes and he would win and stuff. They're not like super staged today. But that was hard. And like I said, he's traveling too. He took some early airplane. Like I said, those schedules were like Los Angeles and then Salt Lake and then come back to Chicago. Like, it's not like he's just wrestling around Chicago and Milwaukee or something like that. Like, no, he's physically have to get, on a plane and travel and then do a 30-minute match. And then 2 days later, do another 30-minute match, against another 230-pound guy. It's not like he's beating up on some 180-pound wrestlers. No, it's the heavyweight division. So he's, going up and then play a 60-minute football game at the highest level. And obviously 37, he did not disappoint. He wasn't like sitting half the time. No, he would play the entire game. And the Bears, like I said, they won the Eastern or the Western Division that year. They end up losing to Washington and Sammy in 37. But it's just a tremendous achievement when you look at what he went through.
The next player I want to talk to, and you just said his name, is a guy who also was a star for the Bears, Red Grange, another legendary name. How did his decision to and he played during the formative years of the NFL. So how did his decision to join the NFL influence the league's popularity and the league's legitimacy in the 1920s as the league is becoming the league and ultimately, what it is today. But Red was so important in the formation, the evolution of the NFL.
Yep, he's star number one. He's probably my favorite, but he did. Everybody says, he saved the NFL. He didn't save the NFL. The NFL was going to continue, What he did was, when he turned pro, went on the barnstorming tour, is he elevated pro football and in turn the NFL with the media coverage and the publicity, and just knowing, hey, there is pro teams playing on Sunday that are called the Chicago Bears and the New York Giants and the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. Like, and he took the game. They played exhibition games in Florida and New Orleans and, California and LA, so those communities who had only read about him at Illinois now get to see him play pro ball and see the level. Oh, wow, this is pretty good. So, so the level of the sport and the media coverage and just the attention is what sort of his lasting legacy. And also, I think, which gets lost because that part is important enough. That would say, oh, that elevated the NFL and he's the first player to do it. But he also made it cool to play pro ball. Like up to that point, it wasn't quite, did you see now? Now you're 21, 20.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but college was the game.
Yeah.
It was college football.
Mm-hmm.
Pro football was, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it wasn't what it is today. In fact, baseball was the game, Major League Baseball. Then it was college football. And maybe in some instances, college football might have been even more popular. Boxing was more popular than
golf.
Football.
Golf
was more popular. Pro football was down the ladder.
Yeah.
And he helped make it, go on. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, because what it did was, up to that point, the NFL had a few stars. Patty Driscoll was playing. Fritz Pollard was playing. Jim Thorpe was an old Jim Thorpe, but some All-Americans didn't even sniff the NFL. No, I'm going to go work. I'm going to become a businessman. I'm going to run my own business or do this. And all of a sudden, when Red, they're like, because Red was the Mr. All-American. He was the good guy, Wheaton Iceman. Would work summers to make a living. And now players like Ernie Nevers, George Wilson, who played against Red on the Barnstorming Tour, thought, well, if Red can play in pro football in the NFL, then it'll be okay for me. It made it more accessible. And then in ensuing years, a lot of the players then started thinking about Bronco Nagurski in 1930, Mel Hein, all these players who were then All-Americans would say, well, that is an option now, where before a lot of the All-Americans, might have just skipped it and say, I'm going to be water camp and I'm just going to, stay at the college and have my name, but instead of, soiling it for money. Well, that definitely changed in the 20s and into the 30s, where then some of the better players like a Don Hudson, like a Sammy Ball, those type of players, would come into the league, Dutch Clark, and say, hey, I wanted to prove I could be good or I could play against the best, because Red did it first and sort of opened the door. And I think that gets a little lost more than, the publicity part of it, which obviously helped the NFL.
Well, he was a great halfback, but tell us a little bit more about his complete game, halfback and defensive back, and how playing both sides of the ball as a halfback and defensive back contributed to the early success, the dynasty of those early years of the Chicago Bears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Red wasn't as good a pro as he was a college player. His 3 years at Illinois is just off the chart. And to somebody who could say, oh, who's the greatest player ever to come out of the University of Illinois, people might say Buckus, but here we are 100 years later, and it's still Red Grange. Red Grange is still, the greatest player in that school's history. And then he has the knee injury his second year, 1927. But I think what gets lost is, just like we talked about Hudson and being a student of the game, he loved football so much, he made himself into a great all-around player, and anybody would want him on their team, especially in the 30s. And obviously he helped the Bears win back-to-back championships in 32 and 33. And it was mainly because he could score. He was really good around the goal line, and he was probably the best defensive back, for 5 or 6 years. with the Bears. Like, there was quotes by Curly Lambeau just saying, we can't throw over him. We stay away from him. And he was, and that's what made him somewhat of an all-pro player, those couple of years. It wasn't his running. It wasn't his open field run. He had lost his speed and some of his maneuverability. It was because he could throw a pass. He could score when it needed to be inside the 5, and he played defense as well as anybody, in the early 30s. And so he's not quite as high on my list as I'd like him, but he became a better all-around player than what people think, especially his NFL career. He was a better all-around player than he was just an open field runner.
Well, I think that, we could talk much more in depth about each of the players that we talked about today. And obviously, the name of my podcast is Sports Forgotten Heroes, and names like Bronco Nagurski and Red Grange are not necessarily forgotten. But the fact that they're really known for their play on one side of the ball as opposed to their play, Don Hudson, on both sides of the ball, is what makes part of their careers forgotten, which is why and I can do this, say they are forgotten heroes when it comes to those particular sides of the ball.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like for you to do, and man, you cover so many of these in your book, NFL 60-minute men. Give us your top 10 list. You don't have to go in depth and tell us about each player. Just rattle it off. Your top 10 list of the greatest 60-minute men in NFL history.
All right, we'll start with 10. We mentioned him a little bit, not as much, as Patty Driscoll. 9 would be, we mentioned him a lot. That's your boy. Cal Hubbard is 9. 8 would be Sid Luckman. Then probably my favorite unknown is number 7. He's the highest non-Hall of Famer on the list, and that's Vern Llewellyn of the Packers, halfback, who I mentioned as a punter. Like, he was just the best player on the team that won 3 championships. So he's 7. Bronco is 6. And then the top 5 is some of the greatest. It's Guy Chamberlain is 5. Mel Hein is 4. Sammy Ball's 3. Don Hudson is 2. And Dutch Clark is 1. So those are my 10. And then like I mentioned, the book has 45. So always good argument. When you see a list or go through the research. So, but those guys to me are the Mount Rushmore of the 60-minute men.
How much fun did you have putting this together?
It was great. I started a series of articles in 2019 for John Turney's site, Pro Football Journal, and that got me started. But I just did like a top 20 and like a little blurb of each guy, and I liked it. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe there's more here, and I could have the players talk about each other. That's why oral histories and footage and that type of stuff. So it took me like a year and a half to do a lot more detailed research, and but enjoyed it a lot because it actually made me learn more about these players than ever before. And like I said, and like you with your forgotten heroes, I don't want them to be forgotten because we all enjoy the game today. We love watching it. We love reading about it. How did that start? It started with these guys, and so they deserve as much as the current era or my sports heroes, of the day, So thanks for having us talk about it.
Absolutely, Chris. I really enjoyed it. The NFL 60-minute men, all-time greats of the two-way player era from 1920 through 1945 by Chris Willis. Chris, tell us where we could get the book, who published the book, and
Yeah, it's published by McFarland Books. So if you know baseball, they do tons of baseball, but they do have football titles. So it's McFarland.com. You purchase there. Just straight from the publisher, or on Amazon if you have an Amazon account, if you love Amazon. So it's there.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Might have to have you back on and talk about a couple of the other guys on this list whom time might have forgotten. Fritz Pollard, Sid Luckman. That's a really interesting one. There's some great names on this list, and I encourage any football fan to pick up a copy. You don't have to read it all at once. You can read it chapter by chapter, a couple pages here and there. Just a lot of fun. Chris, thank you again so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
No, thanks for having me, Warren. You do a great job with the show. Like a big fan. So keep up the good work and keeping some of these memories alive.
Anytime you can come back. Thank you so much. Some of the other 60-Minute Men Chris covers in his book include the great Duke Slater, Guy Chamberlain, Ernie Nevers, Jack McBride, Red Dunn, Ox Emerson, so many others. His book is filled with much information on all of these guys and offers you an opportunity to go back in time when the NFL was a much different and tougher game than it is today. Thanks again to Chris for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Definitely going to have him back. And thanks to all of you for listening. And I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude. And I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.